last section of our session, of the session and of the course today. I'll start by going through fusion policy and regulation in the US, and then we have a awesome guest speaker who will be sharing their experience on Capitol Hill advocating for fusion. So I guess there's like two distinct approaches here, and the countries can fit into two buckets. And that is that only two countries have regulated fusion independently from fission. And the other bucket is that other major players are building dedicated regulation for fusion, but currently treat fusion like fission. The United Kingdom was actually the first one to determine that fusion will not be regulated like fission. Instead, it would actually be regulated uh, by the Health and Safety Executive and Environment Agency, again, rather than by the Office of Nuclear Regulation. And they actually decided to codify this decision into law through the Energy Act in 2023. If there's one thing you remember from this section out of this presentation, it is this slide. This slide shows the overnight capital, like construction cost of fission plants in the United States before and after the 3 Mile Island accident. And the 3 Mile Island accident obviously induced a lot of regulations, in a lot of ways warranted, but also it has thus far stifled really the deployment of fission in the US. And my main takeaway that I want you to take away from this is that fusion should not, again, be regulated like fission. It's inherently different. And this plot just really shows the impact of regulatory costs on nuclear energy systems. So in the US, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the NRC, regulates fission, obviously, and regulates fusion in the US. And in 2023, they decided to regulate it, or sorry, I will get to that. But what I want you to know from this slide is either states can choose to be overseen by the NRC directly or become an NRC agreement state. As you see, most of the states are agreement states, and the advantage of being an agreement state has to do with it allows states to curate the regulation to their community-specific needs. Otherwise, the NRC will regulate broadly, and the states are not allowed to necessarily regulate less strict than what the NRC standards are, but again, they're able to adapt those standards to their specific jurisdiction. So in April 2023, the NRC voted unanimously to regulate fusion separate from fission, again, kind of following the UK's decision to do this. They regulate it like a particle accelerator, again, as opposed to a fission reactor. And regarding the most recent advancement is the Advanced Act, which codified this decision into law. And this is so important because, because it's in law, it guarantees, or rather gives more assurance towards regulatory certainty and simplicity and compliance, establishes a clear legal distinction between fusion and fission, so the NRC is not able to go back on their decision. Obviously, further legislation could be proposed to change that, but it being codified into law is a major advancement that should not be understated. I'll briefly touch on this. I know in the techno-economics section, I showed this slide, but what I want to highlight in this section of the presentation is how instrumental policy instruments are, like subsidies, tax incentive tariffs, research investments, to drive the adoption of clean energy sources. For instance, the global adoption of solar energy has been nearly entirely driven by government policies aimed at promoting cleaner energy sources. And in the TEA section, I showed this to highlight the learning rate. And while obviously the learning rate is still a key takeaway from this, I want you to understand how policy is the instrument that can enable this learning rate, that can enable these adoptions. In China, for instance, being a leader in producing solar energy, as Sergey or Doug had mentioned, they don't have their own natural resources, and so there is that greater incentive to invest in other energy generation technologies. But if you can imagine if the U.S. invested in fusion as deeply, it could definitely result in fusion experiencing a similar learning curve. And I know I showed this bar chart in my TEA presentation, but I want to reiterate the point that, the lower bound here is assuming non-fission regulatory pathway, but the upper bound is assuming a fission-like regulatory pathway, which is why it's just so key and so critical to ensure they are regulated separately, differently.